And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Not all jobs require a professional license, but many do, and barriers to getting those licenses are exacerbating the already serious workforce crisis facing public and private employers, whether it is social workers or psychologists or nurses, perhaps coming from another state. Delays in getting licensed mean people can't do the jobs that are so desperately needed. So what can state lawmakers do to ease this bottleneck? Joining me now is Democratic State Representative Mari Levitt, who serves on the Post-Secondary Education and Workforce Committee. You just heard in the first half from the chair and ranking Republican on that committee. And then also Republican State Representative Greg Cheney, who serves on the Consumer Protection and Business Community. Great to see both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So in the first half, we kind of got a level set on this issue, talked about how workforce shortages have built over time, some of the steps that are being taken in the committee that you serve on to try to start to address this. Obviously, this professional licensure issue is big, but let me start where I did with the other members. Of just as you think about a problem that is this large and complicated and a 105-day legislative session, sort of what you can reasonably accomplish to start to address this. And maybe before we even do that, let me hear you describe what the problem is from your perspective. How do you see this? So let's identify the issue.
Sure. So you heard earlier that we have a workforce shortage in many different industries across our state, and Washington isn't unique, but we have an opportunity to do that, and it is in healthcare, it's in behavioral health, and trying to find ways to quickly get folks to work who are trained is important to do. And this session, I've seen more bills introduced than any other, and this is my fifth session on this, recognizing the workforce shortage. That didn't start this year. It's been ongoing and it's been bubbling up, but certainly this year it's exacerbated, and we see that. And so the problem is not having enough workers and having folks who can have the ability to get to work and could get to work if we would remove those barriers for them.
And then before we get into like specific policy details, like generally, what do you think legislators can or should be doing to alleviate the issue?
Yeah, I think legislators, in addition to looking at loan repayment programs and scholarships and other ways to help our workforce get trained and increase capacity, I think that we can take a look at our occupational licensing and our licensing barriers in our states and find ways to remove those that we have an ability to through statute, encourage our agencies to perhaps do things differently to assess the issue and then find ways to do that, and to figure out a way by listening to our workers and industry to be able to remove those barriers as we can.
Okay, great. So Representative Cheney, it's the same question. Like, how are you sizing up the problem, or when you talk to your constituents, describing what you're seeing?
Sure. I think one of the things we're seeing certainly is in the behavioral health space. As part of what we're also wrestling with on Capital Budget Committee is how we're dealing with our behavioral health crisis, particularly in light of True Blood, and what we need to do with respect to the federal court's orders in that scenario. But workforce challenge is very tough for behavioral health. It's also tough for our small businesses. We see that in the restaurant industry. We see it in our malls and our shopping centers. We're looking for folks to come in, and we simply can't find them. And it's not simply a matter of raising wages. It's also a matter of almost a disappeared or lost generation. That 20 to 25-year-old range went somewhere over COVID, and trying to coax them back into the workforce is proving to be a real challenge, particularly for small businesses. So I think some of the things we can do, we probably agree on most of them. We can look at our occupational licensing, make sure that if we're going to have occupational licensing and professional licensures, that we do so when there's a clear safety concern or a threshold that needs to be met, whether it's training hours or otherwise, making sure that we re-examine those to get in as many folks into the workforce who we possibly can in light of our crisis.
And can you give me an example from the business committee? I think you've talked about cosmetologists,
yes,
for instance. But what would be a kind of real-world example that's before the legislature?
Sure. So we've got a couple of bills in the business committee to look at occupational licenses. So that might be cosmetologists, haircutting. It could be architects, things like that. I proposed a bill that certainly impacts my neighborhood. That's Clark County, Washington. We have any number of folks coming across the border from Oregon and the Portland metro area who are now living in Clark County to potentially give a 6-month temporary license if they're already licensed in Oregon or California, where we can say, yeah, you know, Oregon and California, probably if you're safe to cut hair there, you're safe to cut hair here. We give them a 6-month license, a temporary license, while they go through our full licensure. Again, streamlining, looking at, you know, are these all necessary regulations, or is there something that we can maybe alleviate some of the regulations while we try to build up our workforce? There's a number of bills around trying to make sure that we've right-sized for safety our occupational licenses.
Okay, so there's the streamlining of licensure, and then there's also this idea of compacts, right? And you've got a bill around audiology and speech pathologists. But what are you trying to solve with that particular bill?
Yeah, and we actually have 3 or 4 compacts introduced this session and passed to last session, an occupational therapist and psychologist, and are part of compacts in 4 other professions as well. And so this year we have the speech audiology compact because we know there aren't enough speech therapists in our schools, and audiologists for our children who are on IEPs who get maybe 3 times a month, 30 minutes is not enough for our children to be successful, or our adult learners. We've got the mental health counseling compact, and we know that there's a behavioral health workforce challenge as well as a healthcare challenge, and getting, allowing mental health counselors, infusing them from other states. Our military spouses often come to our state needing to be able to work. When 1 in 5 Washington families, military families, have food security challenges. We also have a nursing compact there's no question about our healthcare workers and needing more nurses, and that's being discussed. That might be that's a little more complicated,
yes,
perhaps,
so
and we'll talk about that. That's come up before. We just passed a dental and dental hygienist compact out of post-secondary education today's Friday, yesterday. That addresses the dental and dental hygienist workforce, both in rural and urban areas. And compacts are great because they're multi-state compacts, and in particular for the mental health compact, you can allow someone, if a family moves out of the state, a worker here in Washington can continue the continuity of care that's important for those families. And they're regulated, so compacts are a great way to continue to streamline that process, but then also get folks to work in those fields. And others I would suggest are probably coming on board, but those are for just this session that are being discussed, and 2 of them are already over in the Senate and the other chamber, and hopefully will be heard soon.
So moving right along. What are you in the business community seeing sort of fault lines and arguments and fights, or has this been pretty smooth sailing when you're talking about the licensure piece?
No, I think there's always concerns maybe coming from folks who are already here that, you know, how would this affect the workforce that's already here? Are we outsourcing our licensing? But I think that Speaker Jenkins had a really good point on her January 5th comments, which was effectively, you know, looking at make sure that if we have safety rules and regulations around professional licensures, that we're doing it for the right reason. We're not just doing it to protect our current workforce. You know, and I think that we try to work very cooperatively. I think that's one of the reasons we're getting along so well. I've only been here a couple of weeks and already building relationships to folks on the other side of the aisle, because these aren't inherently partisan issues. Everyone wants to be able to go to a restaurant and have enough servers at the restaurant. Everyone wants to be able to, the audiology issue and speech therapist issue. I know my own son just got done waiting about 7 to 8 months to get access to a speech therapist. So these aren't partisan issues. These are real challenges that families are facing, that our communities are facing. And so I think we have some, maybe some disagreements on the best way to go forward on some of these issues. But the reality is, I think everybody's focused on the same goal, and that makes these conversations so much easier to have.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Speaker Jenkins. She's given the example of social workers and how many hours they need to get in before they get licensed or credentialed, and then and they're paying for supervision. So, before it's costing them money. Is there an appetite or an interest in the state stepping up and offering to pay for some of that?
There is a proposal, and I think, I agree with Speaker Jenkins that we have to look at every and all options. And in the social worker, they were doing 4,000 hours beyond, which is ridiculous. And so reducing that, there is a bill that's moving forward and got out of committee as well to reduce those hours. And to take a look at how do you pay folks to do those hours while they're going through to make it palatable. I mean, social workers are so critical to our entire state infrastructure for families to succeed, and they're not high-paying jobs; they're risky jobs, and to expect, the profession who has over time evolved to a place where they've added these requirements that you start to wonder why. And what is it that, what's the value added? And that's a good example. And we're taking a look at it in other professions, perhaps stipends as well, for those reasons.
Do you think, is that something Republicans could get on board with, public funding of stipends, or to offset some of the cost that the individual who's going through the training is would traditionally pay?
That's a really good question.
And I understand you're new to the legislature and you're not speaking for the caucus. So,
3 weeks here, I don't know if I want to get...
He does.
But what is your sort of, speaking for yourself, does that,
I think
is that palatable, or is that kind of like... Ugh?
I think it's an interesting question. I've talked before about the need. My familiarity is with behavioral health space. Okay. Spending a couple years on a nonprofit before coming to the legislature, dealing with these tackling workforce shortages issues. Okay. And I think we have to look at our entire behavioral health, how we're training into the workforce. So maybe that means reaching back into our, second, third year undergraduates as you're a sophomore, junior. How do we incentivize these career paths? Do we start putting scholarships right at the sophomore, junior level, even before they go out and get that master's degree? How do we finance that master's degree to get them into the workforce quickly? One of the facilities that's down in Vancouver area, they have 16 behavioral health beds and none of them are filled, none of them have patients because there's no workforce there. So it's a real challenge, and I think we have to go back, and some of these issues, these compacts are great. I think we can try to bring in as many people as quickly as possible, but there's also, I think, a realistic component here that it may take 6 to 7 years to really build out these professions, and part of that is going to be have to go back, at least in my view, go back to the undergraduate level and start incentivizing at the undergraduate level into these career paths. And that's something, certainly, I think that I can't speak for the caucus, but it was something that I've thought a lot about because I've been dealing with them, like I said, before coming to the legislature. So.
Well, and Chair Slatter mentioned the idea that she was thinking about this in sort of 3 buckets, and the third bucket was the retention piece. And we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it here, but let's say you can get then staff to come to that 16-bed facility. That's going to be a really hard work environment, right? These are acutely sick people, and it's a high-stress job. The hours aren't great. It's got to be staffed 365 days a year. If you're not paid well, if you don't feel the work conditions are good, you can have turnover issues. And you've got to go find somebody. So it's not like there's any simple answers here. Right. So we talked about licensure. There's also scope of practice debates going on, and this is you could give us probably a couple of concrete examples, but allowing people to do things that normally are reserved for the MD or the dentist or the eye doctor. Like, what's being contemplated, and how are you guys navigating these?
Yeah, so there's the licensing requirements, certainly, and streamlining those and making it easier and reducing hours. Then there's scope of practice conversations that are often more dicey and more difficult to have. One that has been ongoing for years, and there's a bill to do it again this year, is in dental therapy. Dentists are opposed, strongly opposed. Dental hygienists are strongly in support. The tribal communities have been doing dental therapy for a while and are allowed to do that. And that from their perspective, it's working well. But there's a concern for scope of practice that if you've got someone who's not trained, or if you're getting your wisdom teeth pulled, or you're doing additional kind of higher, what the dentist might say is higher level kinds of order things, there should be additional training and education. The optometrist And eye surgeons are also in the same debate this year, strongly in debate in the similar kind of scope of practice. The optometrists are saying, look, we can do these added things. We have additional technology that allows us to do this in a safe way. You know, public safety is paramount to us too, and it'll be less expensive for families to be able to have us do that. And also we can, you know, we're in rural areas, we're in other areas where maybe we don't have the specialist to be able to do that. And so let us do that. The other side is saying, wait a minute, you know, you're not trained to do that. And so, and those are just two examples among many that we're addressing this year, and we'll see where they get.
How do you as a legislator navigate that? I'd like to hear from both of you. Obviously, you're newer to this discussion,
Yeah.
but like, you know, two sides, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they both are making pretty compelling arguments. Where does that leave lawmakers?
Well, for dental therapy, it's left lawmakers doing nothing, candidly, for the last few years, or navigating or trying to find a different pathway forward. Optometrist is bringing this to us. This is the first year. I expect that it will be continued conversation. I could be wrong. But I do think that that's fair to find ways to where there is an opportunity to allow workers who are trained, who have an ability maybe to get an additional endorsement or get some other opportunities, and to be able to provide those. I think we have to look at those options with, again, public safety as a matter of concern, and get past the arguments of potential protectionism, which sometimes I think crops up in scope of practice conversations. Not always, but I'm trying to figure out where the real issue lies, and I think that's our role, is to wade in and where are their services and where they're not.
Is there, so there's, you know, the legislature is doing what it feels it can do. How much, what does the private sector need to be doing? Because, you know, you gave the example of the restaurant where,
Sure.
and, you know, in my lifetime, I have never seen until the last couple of years situations where there are signs on the door saying, there's one downtown in Olympia right now. Our other two locations are open, but this location is closed now because of a lack of staff. Or you show up at the drive-thru. Sorry, we don't have the staff today. The drive-thru is closed. You have to come in the store, or vice versa. Like,
Yeah.
These are the times we live in.
So there's a couple of things that private businesses can do, and I think already are doing, to try to alleviate some of this workforce shortages. We had the credit unions up on the Hill, I think, walking through, and one of our local credit unions down in the Vancouver area has a great program. They actually have a credit union satellite location in each high school. And so not only can students come up and take out money and learn basic accounting or at least checkbook, you know, figuring out how to run a checkbook, right? But it also gives kids in the high school the ability to come in and actually work and earn money and learn how to be a teller, and then they can graduate right out into the workforce immediately upon high school. And so part of what we can do is really partner we talk about running start programs for more our graduate, our college bound kids. What about a running start programs for the trades? And I think there's some bills out there where we can really take some of these best practices, because I hear from employers, particularly in the construction space, they want access to our high school youth because they think they can train them and get them high paying jobs very quickly after high school. So looking at how do we partner and merge some of that, rethinking a little bit perhaps our high school curriculum to more hands-on workforce-oriented curriculum while still getting basic math and other, you know, skills they need in order to perform in the workforce. So.
Yeah, and we have often, I mean, we've really thought about the community college system as being that bridge for the youth who aren't going on to four-year. You're now saying, you know, what about at the high school level? How would you answer that question of you know, what is the role of the private sector, or where can the legislature support the private sector?
Yeah, I think the private sector has an incredibly important role to play, and I think they have been doing some of that, and I think they're more involved than they ever have been, whether it's on advisory boards, taking a look at from industry and certain communities, saying this is what we need, how can we partner together so that you, community and technical college, can do our training for us, and then we can get those folks to work. I think they're serving in capacity in terms of some are looking at their licensing and their requirements, like does this make sense anymore, and making contributions in that way. They're encouraging and they're very involved in trying to figure out How do we get more students to get to the attainment rate, which is, it's 70%. We know that some form of going to college in
This is
some
actually
way.
getting your degree.
Getting your degree, a certificate is important to our private industry because they need skilled labor. And so they're providing and engaging in those conversations. And so I think they're vital, and I don't think we can do it without our private industry helping shape what these conversations are.
So in the couple minutes we have left, what do you think success in the 2023 session would look like, understanding that this is a multi-year effort? What would feel good?
You go first, please.
Oh, wow. I think success will be moving these compacts forward with strong bipartisan support, and I think we have that. I think success will be streamlining our professions, working with our agencies to assist them to move quicker. I think success will be helping our certified nursing assistants who want to get to work, who may live in Vancouver, who have to drive here to Olympia to take a test because there are no testing centers
Really? That's happening.
in
Yep.
Vancouver.
Yep.
And that we find folks to do those testing. And I think success will be getting workers to work, and that we reduce those barriers for them.
Yeah, I generally agree with everything the good representative just said. I think, this issue of protectionism, I think it's going to require all of us to look differently at how we're engaging with our workforces, and that's across the spectrum, private enterprise, government. Are we doing what we need to do to protect public health and safety? But to the extent that there are other licensing barriers beyond that, can we rethink and relook at them? One of the things that's, I think, maybe unsaid in these discussions is oftentimes those who have the least have the hardest time breaking through some of these professional licensing barriers. It sets up, unfortunately, perhaps they were a good idea at one point, but now they're really harming, in my view, historically marginalized communities because they can't get in. They have the least ability and opportunity from a historical basis to be able to break beyond these barriers. And so I'm a small business attorney when I'm not here, and I love helping people set up a new business for the first time, and to have that opportunity and to be able to do that in a way that you can feel like you are contributing something of value to society and doing it on your own. I think that is the goal, at least the emotional goal, that I think we all want for those people who want to join the workforce. And again, but it's gonna require all of us to look at things differently. How is what we're doing working? It doesn't appear to be, so how can we do it different going into the 2023 session?
I also just think about the idea that especially younger people now are so used to kind of frictionless consumer experiences, shopping on Amazon, doing things online, not having a lot of barriers. And yet government, we used to talk about red tape. Now we got to come up with a new term that describes sort of the online, but just making it easier, making it more frictionless. Is there, just briefly, is anybody talking about that? Just it should be 2 clicks away or whatever.
Well, it's for 2 clicks away for our military spouses would allow them when they're get their station duty assignment, if they're living in Kentucky, that they can do 2 clicks away, go on online, figure out what their field is, figure out the agency, and turn in their application, and we move it within a short period of time. And the same with any others. And so trying to figure out how do we remove those barriers, how do we get rid of the things that don't make sense anymore, I think is incumbent upon us to do the 2 clicks away to get to work. And workforce is the topic du jour, and it's the most important thing, I think, on our plate besides housing this session. And if we don't move some of these places to ensure that we're doing competency-based opportunities, if you've got the skills and you can do the job, let them do the job.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Representatives Levitt and Cheney. Thank you so much.
You.